welcome to Buffy and the Art of Story Season 7, a podcast that recaps one episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer at a time, focusing on its story elements. Today, I'm talking about Season 7, Episode 10, Bring on the Night, where Giles returns to Sunnydale with 3 potential vampire slayers, and Buffy fights an ubervamp summoned by the first. I am Lisa M. Lilly, author of the Awakening Supernatural thriller series, the Q.C. Davis crime novels, and the Writing as a Second Career books for writers, which include the Buffy and the Art of Story books. If you'd like to get more Buffy and the Art of Story content and hear each episode early, you can support the podcast on patreon.com/LisaMLilly and get access to all of that and more. Along with the recap of Bring on the Night, today we'll talk about how to introduce new characters and make their choices believable, even though we don't know them very well, why goals for your protagonist and antagonist are key to driving a story forward, and what happens when they're not clear, what the way Buffy and friends treat Andrew says about their characters, and when too many open story questions frustrate the audience rather than adding to suspense. There will be no spoilers except in the foreshadowing section at the end, but I'll give you plenty of warning. Okay, let's dive into the Hellmouth. Bring on the Night aired the first time on December 17, 2002. It was written by Marty Noxon and Douglas Petrie and directed by David Grossman. It starts, as it should, with some opening conflict, though it is minor. Xander sweeps up broken glass from the living room floor. It is from the last episode where the Bringers attacked, so we're picking up right after that in time. And Xander says, "It's a loop, like the mummy hand. I'm doomed to replace these windows for all eternity. Maybe we should just board these things up until things are less hellmouthy." This calls back to the season 6 episode where Buffy got caught in various loops, including the one with the mummy hand in the magic box. It's a good way to lampshade or call out that not only have the windows been broken before in the Summers house, the last episode started almost exactly like this one, with Xander fixing things, everyone cleaning up, and a round of exposition. If you are going to repeat yourself as a writer, it's not a bad idea to have the characters recognize that, yes, they are doing the same thing again and have some frustration about it. That way the reader knows you are not just being a lazy writer. This is part of the story that they keep having to go through this experience. Anya holds up a book and says she's finding nothing. Willow asks if Buffy is sure that this evil called itself the First, because remember, Buffy had that realization last episode that this was the same entity or force that plagued Angel. And Buffy says she's pretty sure and that it claimed to be the original evil. Anya is pretty funny here. She says, oh, she heard that all the time in her demon days. I'm bad, I'm bad, I'm bad. Does it make you horny? And then she says, or terrified. But Buffy is sure that this wasn't a line. It was an anxious and enormous evil, and it nearly got Angel to kill himself. This is a good way to quickly remind readers of amends if they don't immediately think of that. And Buffy, understandably, now worries what the First might get Spike to do. Anya and Xander comment on Andrew still being out, and he was just about starting to squeal when the Bringers attacked. He said something about the seal of Danthazar. So Andrew still tied to that chair, still either asleep or knocked out from earlier. Dawn muses that he might be faking so as not to answer questions, and she smacks Andrew. This carries on just a bit the actions of Anya and Xander last episode interrogating Andrew. And it goes along with the tone of that, the bit of humor, the idea that Dawn now is slapping Andrew. Buffy tells her to stop, but she is frustrated and shuts her book and asks for the Watcher's Codex. Joyce hands Buffy a book and offers her some tea. Buffy accuses her of being the first, and Joyce tells her she's so tired she's not making sense. Joyce also says Buffy can't win against this thing if she doesn't get some rest, but then tells her she needs to wake up. And at 2 minutes 40 seconds, Xander tells Buffy she's dreaming and to wake up. And we see that she was dozing, her head on her hand. She kind of jerks awake and says she didn't see anything when Xander asks what. This does more or less fit Buffy's pattern of not sharing with her friends, but as an audience member, I feel frustrated because she does know that Dawn saw Joyce last episode, and I thought that at least as to Buffy and Dawn, that season 6 worked through some of these issues Buffy had with shutting Dawn out. I suppose everyone's there, so maybe Buffy just isn't ready to share, and it does seem like it was a dream and not the first. The scene cuts to a cave and underground tunnels. The bringers are chanting and the Turrican drags Spike. The first evil in the form of Spike, and then Drusilla taunts the real Spike, and then the Turrican kicks him. The first tells the Turrican that as soon as the moon comes, he'll have his carnage. Little girls tear easily, and until then, he can have fun with Spike. The Turrican kicks Spike. He screams as the credits start at 4 minutes 13 seconds. Usually around here or sooner, we'll see the story spark or inciting incident that gets the main plot rolling. And it could be that the story spark was when the first, as Drusilla, says the Turrican can have his carnage and refers to the little girls. We will see potentials arrive soon, and they are in danger. But I have some struggles throughout the episode sorting out exactly what the main plot is, and the story would have more power if there were a clearer goal for the first or for Buffy beyond just a passing reference. Now, certainly you can develop your goal later, bring it out later, but the struggle to even sort out what is starting the main plot here foreshadows a bit the way the whole episode will proceed. It's also not clear what is the first trying to do with Spike other than torture him. For now, it looks like it just wants to torture Spike. As with the last episode, Buffy's goal at the beginning is just to learn more about the first. Well, last episode to learn about the evil, she did find out it was the first. Now she wants to know about the first. Not a super compelling goal, especially for a couple episodes in a row, to have just the seeking of knowledge, especially when there's nothing active about it. Usually the series deals with that by having a talisman that has to be found, or a specific monster that has to be fought, or some magical item, something that can create an active goal along with seeking knowledge. On return from the credits, Dawn and Anya throw water on Andrew to try to wake him up. They're about to try hot water instead of cold, but Buffy enters the room. Anya and Dawn scramble to the couch, and Dawn says nothing, and then stutters when Buffy asks her what. But Andrew starts to wake up, cutting off Buffy's suspicions, and he references the events of the last episode. He says to Buffy, I was about to be dead. You saved me. And Buffy says, for the time being, but if you don't tell us what we need to know, then I'm going to offer you to the first on a platter and let him chop you into tiny pieces. And Andrew responds, the first what? Anya says the name of the evil thing that pretended to be Warren to get you to kill Jonathan. Andrew says, oh, not very ominous sounding, but Dawn interjects, no, it is if you understand the context. Andrew counters with, no, evil names should be like Lex or Voldemort and all of this too is a way to poke a little fun at the fact that the first evil doesn't sound super scary. So it's a little bit of awareness on the writer's part. Buffy now cuts in and says, "Hey, I was intimidating here." And Andrew says, "Oh, sorry, go ahead." Buffy sighs and says, "Forget it, where's the seal?" This is all more exposition. It does come out through some minor conflict. So if you're going to have a lot of exposition, conflict is definitely a great way to go. I am not sure we need all of this. They are mostly talking about things that just happened in the last episode. And I am trying to keep in mind that this was made before streaming services. I believe you could get the DVD sets at that point, but I'm not positive. So it was more necessary to remind viewers, but it adds to this story feeling slow. So far, we mostly have just reiterated what happened before. Now there is something somewhat new. It's 6 minutes, 25 seconds into the episode, and Andrew takes Buffy, Xander, and Dawn to Sunnydale High. They go through the basement, and after some wrong turns, find the seal of Danthazar. Andrew says he doesn't know what the seal was supposed to do, but it needed blood and there wasn't enough. And he wants to rush away as soon as they've found it, showing either fear or guilt or both. Dawn notices the blood on the wheel that Spike was tied to. They don't know it's Spike's blood, but Dawn says, "Looks like the first made another sacrifice or a music video." Buffy says the seal could have been activated and guesses that might be why it needed Spike. Andrew says he had nothing to do with it, and Xander points out he killed his best friend. Andrew says that no, it's okay. Jonathan told him he is in a place of light and peace, and Xander tells him he got tricked by a fake ghost. I like this conflict a bit more because we are seeing more of that emotion from Andrew, but it is repetitive of what we just heard in the last scene. This is probably part of the point with Andrew, that he continues in denial. But personally, I could do with a little less of it. Buffy tells them to stop bickering. She grabs a shovel and says they can't leave the seal exposed and they need to cover it. Unclear how Buffy knows that, but it seems logical that if the first wanted it uncovered, maybe covering it is a good idea, so they throw dirt on it with shovels that are still leaning there near it. As they leave, still carrying the shovels, Xander and Andrew bond over a Wonder Woman comic, Catacombs, that reminds them of going through the basement. They have this nice moment together to Xander's dismay. He does not want to be like Andrew. Then they run into Principal Robin Wood, who is also carrying a shovel because he just buried Jonathan in the last episode. The timing of Robin Wood's little scenes throughout these couple episodes raises some questions. It seemed like he went down in the basement sometime during the night, but not just like half an hour ago. So how long did it take him to bury Jonathan? It is sunny out. It is daytime. When you cut between scenes to show what's going on with different characters in a different plot line or subplot, you don't have to make those fit completely with the timeline. That wouldn't always be possible, but it can trip you up when you then have the characters cross paths. Robin asks Buffy about being sick. Dawn chimes in with details about Buffy vomiting and oozing, a callback to last episode, but then says, but the doctor gave Buffy some pills. At the same time, Buffy says the doctor gave her some cream, and she's all better now. Robin Wood looks a little suspicious, but then Buffy notices his shovel. Wood volunteers that someone left it in the courtyard, and he was returning it. So maybe that is the answer to the timeline. Maybe Robin left it in the courtyard and is returning it. It raises a question that I never thought of until just now. Does Robin remember what he did? If the first was simply controlling him, might he not know that he's the one who left it in the courtyard? Unclear. Buffy comments that that is some full service principling, but then Robin Wood notices her shovel, which makes me wonder, why did they carry the shovels out? Buffy says she was helping Dawn with a school project, a time capsule, and Dawn brightly chimes in, "Hello, people of the future," and gives some examples of what's in there. Robin seems to accept it, but tells Buffy if she's better, they could really use her back at work. He's been waitlisting kids to see her. Buffy promises to be there tomorrow. They walk off in opposite directions. Robin looks back at Buffy, and then Buffy looks back at Robin, clearly both suspicious. That is a nice way to show that Robin has questions about Buffy, which any thinking person should. But as with last episode, not a whole lot happens to this point in the episode that's new. And that, plus the lack of clear goals for the antagonist and protagonist, makes it just feel kind of meh. At 9 minutes 37 seconds, Willow and Anya at the dining table get ready for a spell. Willow is going to try to locate the first. Xander and Buffy have returned, and Xander suggests that Buffy go get some rest. She hasn't slept for 2 days. Buffy says she can't rest. He tries to reassure her that they've dealt with these kinds of things before, but she says he never saw the first. She did. She felt it, but she cuts off when lightning bolts shoot from Willow. Streaks of red light go into Willow's nose and mouth. A scary image bursts out of her. There are more lightning bolts that send Anya and Buffy flying across the room. Willow's eyes turn black, and she says, "You'll only make me stronger." Xander smashes the bowl that was used for the spell ingredients. That ends the spell. Willow collapses, sobbing, distraught, and she says it's still in her. The evil is still in her. She begs Buffy not to make her do anything else, and Buffy promises she won't ask Willow to do magic to fight the first until they know what they're dealing with. Buffy stalks for the door, as Xander tells her, at least don't go alone. So apparently Buffy is going out to search for the first. But she is determined. She says it's out there and it's hurting her friends, and she'll find it. This is probably why we got the back and forth with Holden Webster, the vampire, in Conversations with Dead People. And there was that whole discussion of Buffy having a superiority complex, thinking she's better than her friends, and feeling inferior to them. I did a Patreon episode on basically why I don't quite buy Buffy's superiority complex. One issue is that usually that involves being condescending, and usually it's where you aren't actually better at something than other people. And I guess we see a little bit of that condescending here when Buffy says, "Well, you didn't see the first, you didn't feel what it's like." The thing is, though, that is true, and I feel more like the writers are trying to justify Buffy shutting her friends out again and going off alone. And while that is an ongoing issue Buffy has, usually there's more of a justification for it. She did it in the beginning of season 2 because she was afraid her friends were going to get hurt or killed, so she isolated, and it came out as anger to try to keep them safe. But normally she wants to join forces with her friends. So maybe there's some fear going on here. I'm not sure. But at least Buffy now has something more active she is doing than researching. She flings open the door, and now we get the first major plot turn. That is the 1/4 turn, as I think of it. It should come from outside the protagonist, spin the story in a new direction, and raise the stakes. And it does all those things here. At 11 minutes into the episode, when Buffy opens the door, Giles is on the other side. They say each other's names by way of greeting, but as Buffy moves to hug Giles, a young woman marches in between them and says, "This is the Slayer? Huh." And Giles says, "Sorry to barge in. I'm afraid we have a slight apocalypse." And we cut to commercial. So from outside of Buffy, Giles appears. We'll find out with 3 potentials and raises the stakes by talking about the apocalypse. On return from commercial, Dawn looks at these 3 girls or young women, their ages aren't clear, and says they're all slayers. Giles clarifies they are potential slayers, and there were more all over the world, but they're down to a handful now. They're all on their way to Sunnydale. And Buffy says the others were murdered, and we get a quick flashback to one of Buffy's visions, I think from the very first episode, where a young woman with pink hair was killed by a bringer. Giles says the Watchers were killed too, and we get a flashback very fast of Giles finding that Watcher who told him it started. What we don't see is that axe swinging at Giles' head, leaving us still to wonder if he might be the first, because it sure looks like he must have been killed too. Giles tells them the attack is on the entire Slayer line and all the Watchers, and Buffy says it'll kill the potentials, then Faith, then Buffy, and now there'll be no way to make another Slayer ever. I have more on this in foreshadowing, but logic would say that it should be first Buffy and then Faith, because the death of Buffy doesn't seem to trigger a new Slayer. Buffy is stronger than Faith, so you get her out of the way, then you get rid of Faith. Then you have a newbie Slayer who's not going to be trained and presumably can pretty easily be killed. And you just kill the potentials whenever, because they're the simplest to get rid of. Willow says they have no information about the first, and Giles says it's because it predates written history. It rarely shows its true face, and the only record is in the Watcher's library. This is a bit like Glory from season 5, who predated written word. There was nothing in the books, and only the Watchers had info, although no one makes reference to that. That's when he tells them the council was destroyed, which shocks everyone. Willow asks about their records. Giles directs Annabelle, one of the potentials, to take some materials out of her bag, some books and files. So we don't see Giles touch anything, adding to that question of whether he might be the first, because we learned last episode the first is not corporeal and can't physically act on its own. Giles says he stole the books and files, and Anya jumps to the conclusion that he blew up the council. He says he didn't. It must have been an agent of the first. He took the files because the council would spend too long debating. It doesn't know any other way to act. Andrew, still tied to the chair, bursts out with, quote, "and it cost them their lives," end quote. Thank you to everyone who rated or reviewed the Buffy and the Art of Story podcast. If you enjoy the podcast and want to help it get out into the world and haven't already done so, please take a moment now to rate or review it in your favorite podcast app, or tell a friend about it, or share it on social media. It helps other Buffy fans and other writers who like Buffy to find the podcast. Buffy tells Xander to gag Andrew, and he does so with duct tape. This really made me uncomfortable because as someone whose allergies get very bad sometimes, that is a nightmare idea for me, to have my mouth covered, because I might not be able to breathe. This got me thinking more about how the gang treats Andrew. I understand that it is there for humor, but I find it really disturbing that the quote-unquote good guys are keeping someone tied to a chair seemingly all day, all night. They took him out to go to the seal, but that would be so uncomfortable. He's sleeping in this chair. Now they are gagging him. And it brings to mind that old saying that if your friend is nice to you and not to the waiter, your friend is not a nice person. It's hard for me to reconcile this treatment of Andrew. So I'd love to hear from you. Does it bother you, or do you just enjoy the comedy? And for sure, there are moments I do enjoy the comedy. As a whole, though, I would have preferred if they found some other way to keep Andrew in check. Giles tells them the first can change form. It only appears in the guise of someone who died, and Willow says, our ghosts. Then he reiterates the rule about it's not corporeal, can't touch anything, only works through those who follow it and the bringers. The potentials start talking about how creepy the bringers are. One of them saw a picture of one. Molly is really spooked, and Annabelle scolds her for prattling on. We learn their names not because they're ever introduced, but Giles calls Annabelle Annabelle, Annabelle calls Molly Molly. On the one hand, it can be nice to integrate names in a somewhat natural way. On the other hand, we are getting 3 new characters here, which is a lot to introduce at one time, and they aren't just characters in the background. They seem to be important. I think it would have helped to skip a little of the repetition and exposition and have Giles introduce them by name. I also would have been more interested to know a tiny bit more about their backgrounds. One references her watcher. Did the others have watchers? There might have been a way to bring that out, and then it would have been something new rather than repeating things we already know. It is good that Giles refers to Annabelle first by name and that she's the one who's carrying the books because she'll be important later. It's also significant that Annabelle is chiding Molly about staying calm, which she will do again later. Giles tells them the first is unlike anything they've faced before. He says there's evil, and then there's the thing that created evil, the source. Buffy responds, and that's what this thing claims to be. And Giles says that's what it is. It has eternity to act, endless resources. He goes on that he doesn't know how to defeat it, but they must find a way. If the Slayer line is eliminated, the Hellmouth has no guardian and the balance is destroyed. He's afraid it falls to Buffy. They'll all help her, but she's the only one with the strength to protect the potentials and the world against what's coming. And Xander says, but no pressure. I really like Xander this episode. He is a sort of voice of reason. He is the first to say to Buffy, why don't you let us do this spell? You can get some rest, even though she doesn't listen. And he is pointing out how much pressure Giles is putting on Buffy. Not that we expect Giles to sugarcoat things, but he is really laying it on here and not offering a whole lot of help. Kennedy is appalled that that's the plan. She doesn't see how one person, even a Slayer, can protect them. Kennedy's the one who walked in first, and it fits that having been unimpressed by Buffy on seeing her, she's the one who raises this question. She points out the Bringers tore apart her watcher, so we know she had one. And why are they camping on the Hellmouth when that's where the first wants to be? Shouldn't they hide on the other side of the earth? Annabelle steps toward her and says, Kennedy, and seems to be about to chide Kennedy as well. Annabelle is definitely the one who seems the most trusting in Giles and Buffy and the most by the book. But Buffy says Kennedy's not wrong. That's why they need to find Spike. Anya sarcastically remarks, sure, he'll help if he's not killing people or crazy or dead or all of those things, which is a good segue to Spike. At 16 minutes, 11 seconds, the Turrican, that uber vampire, is waterboarding Spike. So again, we're just going to see the Turrican torture Spike. This also raises a consistency problem. The writers have forgotten, apparently, that vampires don't need to breathe. That's why Angel couldn't save Buffy when she died in Prophecy Girl. Spike nonetheless goes limp, and the Turrican pulls him out of the water. And he does spit out some water when he comes to. So I suppose we could say that while vampires don't need to breathe, having your lungs filled with water wouldn't be great, but why is he inhaling water if he doesn't have to breathe? Anyway, the first, as Drusilla says, she loves vampires. They are so hard to kill. She chides Spike for trying to tell Buffy their secrets and says she's not done with him yet. She directs the Turrican to grab Spike and put him under the water again. So we still have no sense of what this first goal is for torturing Spike, other than just being evil. It is far less interesting if the antagonist is just being evil to be evil. It's more compelling when the evil thing has a specific goal. Even if the goal is something like creating chaos, we have trickster antagonists like Ethan Rain who just like chaos, but even that is more specific than what the first is doing here. At 17 minutes, 16 seconds, Giles and Buffy walk and talk outside. This can be a good way to make exposition more interesting. Instead of two people sitting in a room and talking, you at least put them in a different place and have them moving. It's even better if you can have the talking done while they are fighting or running away in grave danger. For the moment, though, they are just walking. Buffy tells him she saw the first, or rather found the bringers the first time under an old Christmas tree. This calls back again to amends. They both agree this is a new kind of bad, and Giles remarks just in time for Christmas. Buffy says she didn't even realize it was December. Maybe they should decorate the rubble. And she asks if Giles might ever show up for a real visit when the world isn't about to end. He promises he will if they survive. And she says she misses him. He says he misses her too. It's never clear why Giles hasn't returned for a visit before this. Surely he's not still worried as he was in season 6 that Buffy can't stand on her own. We don't know. Does he have a life in England that he doesn't want to leave? What is he doing there? I might have liked a little bit about that, even if we still wondered if he's the first. Again, rather than the it's really bad conversation, which we've had a couple times now in this episode. I also find it odd that they never hug or touch. I know on first viewing of this episode, and minor spoilers, the next one, I didn't necessarily focus on he's not touching anything, though I did wonder if he was the first, but it just felt off. At 18 minutes 3 seconds, Andrew asks how long Xander has followed Buffy. Xander clarifies he doesn't follow her, she's his best friend. Andrew says he thinks Buffy seems like a good leader, her hair is shiny, and he asks if she makes Xander stab things. So this is humor I enjoy. It shows us how Andrew's mind works and how he envisions what being Buffy's friend might be like. Willow has a stack of sheets and pillowcases. She's finding places for the potentials to sleep. Kennedy raises objections to everything Willow proposes, and Willow finally tells her, why doesn't she make the arrangements? Kennedy quickly agrees and says Willow better not hog the covers. Willow is quite flustered. And this is the first time we see someone other than Tara, since Tara's death, have an interest, a romantic interest in Willow. And I think a lot went into constructing Kennedy's character, keeping in mind how devastated the fans were and Willow was by Tara's death. Kennedy is clearly not like Tara. Tara was a bit shy. She was warm and supportive. She encouraged almost everyone around her. She rarely created conflict. Kennedy, on the other hand, immediate conflict, immediately skeptical of Buffy, raising objections, some of them really good ones, to Giles' plan of just putting it all on Buffy. And Kennedy is very assertive with her interest in Willow. That part, I feel, was necessary. I don't think the fans were ready to see Willow feel interested in someone because it isn't that long since Tara's death. So it might be hard to accept that Willow would even notice another woman, but because Kennedy is more assertive, Willow can be hesitant and flustered and surprised, and we don't feel she's disloyal to Tara. At 19 minutes 4 seconds in the kitchen, the potentials are quite hungry after a failure with the mac and cheese. I think Dawn tried to make it. Molly grabs a box of cookies and kind of apologizes, but she has a case of nerves after Giles's lecture. Dawn is all for it. She feels a cookie problem herself, which is really nice. I like seeing Dawn trying to make these three potentials feel at home. At 19 minutes 26 seconds, Buffy and Giles are at the Christmas lot. It's nighttime now, and Buffy is looking for the cave entrance where she found the bringers before. She falls in a hole and says, "Found it." I did have a few questions about why Buffy went out at night, but Buffy doesn't know about the Turrican, and there's nothing about the bringers that suggests they only act at night, so there's really no reason not to. And this is a good example of dramatic irony where the audience knows something Buffy doesn't. It raises a lot of tension. We know there's this ubervamp around, and I wish Buffy were doing this in the daytime. But Buffy is unaware. She looks around the cave tunnels. Something rushes past, too fast for her to see it, but then the Turrican attacks. It's a really tough fight. The Turrican mostly has the upper hand. Buffy gets in some good kicks, especially when she swings around by grabbing a stalactite or stalagmite. I never remember which is which. And then she starts getting the better of the Turrican. We now hit the midpoint of the episode at 21 minutes. This is where usually you'll see a midpoint commitment to the quest or a major reversal for the protagonist. And here we get a major reversal because when Buffy stakes the Turrican, it just pulls out the stake. It does not dust or die. Buffy is shocked and we go to commercial. One thing undercuts this moment for me, which is that it is similar to what happened with Kakistos when Faith came to town. Kakistos was a very old vampire, and just staking him didn't do it. And ultimately, Buffy and Faith found a bigger stake. Best I remember, it was almost like a fence pole. I suppose it makes sense that that doesn't flash to Buffy's mind immediately, and to be fair, it is just her, not her and Faith, but it frustrates me, as with the failure to reference Glory, that the episode acts as if Buffy has never faced anything like this before. Understandably, in the moment, Buffy looks scared and shocked. She does keep fighting, but the Turrican grabs her by the neck, lifts her. She finally grabs something from the side of the cave. Maybe she breaks off a branch. I can't quite see what it is. Bangs the Turrican on the head. It lets go. Buffy scrambles up the inner wall of the cave. It keeps grabbing at her. It gets her leg at one point, but she makes it out just as the sun is rising. We see Giles' silhouette looking a bit ominous, and the Turrican cringes away from the sun. Another timing question here, because I do not think it was night when Giles arrives with the potential. So were they talking well into the night? Did it take Giles and Buffy that long to find this hole? The timing's a little iffy here. I probably wouldn't notice it if otherwise the plot was grabbing me more. Back at the Summers house, it is now sunlight. All the potentials are awake and eating. They apologize to Buffy when she comes in for the British invasion and explain they're still on London time. Kennedy asks if Buffy's all right, seeing how battered she looks. Buffy says it was just a fight, and she says to Giles something like, "Do you want to tell me with what?" He is not sure he should say now. Buffy says, "You mean not in front of the next generation?" A reference to the Star Trek show. Buffy tells him there's no time to coddle the newbies. Annabelle takes notes as Giles tells him about the Turrican. It is something more than a vampire. As a Neanderthal is to humans, the Turrican is to vampires. An entirely different race. It's the vampire that other vampires fear, and he thought it was a myth. Molly looks very worried again. Annabelle asks if Buffy slayed it. Buffy says no, it's out there somewhere, and Molly asks what it wants, and Buffy says all of us dead. But she adds that sunlight is keeping it away. Giles tells her to go get some rest. She says she can't sleep today. Being exhausted comes with the gig. She tells the potentials to wait it out. She is going to work to see what she can find out, but she'll be back by sunset. Giles asks what she can do to research or find out more information, and she claims she has the best plan ever. But at 24 minutes, 29 seconds, the scene cuts to Buffy at work. She's on the phone. She says she already checked the basement and found nothing, but maybe the first isn't ready for modern technology, and she types manifestations of evil into a search engine. She gets over 900,000 responses and hangs up to narrow the search. but she ends up adding in the movies when Robin Wood appears and looks over her shoulder. Buffy claims she likes those evil, evil movies. Robin says he's not a fan of scary movies, even the hokey ones. He thinks they go to a place kids could stand to avoid. She says it's not for the kids, but he tells her, quote, once you see true evil, it can have some serious afterburn, and then you can't unsee what you saw, ever. Robin starts to walk off. Buffy looks unsettled and asks what kinds of movies he likes. With his back still to her, he says mysteries. He loves finding out what it's all about at the very end. The scene cuts to the first as Drusilla taunting a battered-looking Spike. She tells him to think of it as a game without rules or the, quote, bothersome winning part, unquote. But he still has to choose a side. When she speaks, she sounds a lot like Drusilla, the way she strings words together and meanders off into concepts and ideas that make sense to her, but not to anyone else. But Spike tells her she is not Drusilla. Drusilla was crazier than the first. She laughs and agrees she's not, but she tells him to choose a side, and their side is delicious. When Spike still resists, the Turrican starts punching him in the face hard over and over. This feels like more filler as with previous episodes. Not much new happens with each of these cuts. To Spike, we get maybe a bit of a goal for the first. Is it trying to get Spike to choose its side? It's not clear why it thinks that having the Turrican torture him is the way to go. It would make more sense to me if the first is doing its best to keep Spike captive so he can't help Buffy. As it is, the torture just feels like torture, again, the first being evil just to be evil, which is not as gripping as when we're intrigued by the motives of the antagonist and even come to understand them. We don't root for the antagonist in most stories, but we might have sympathy or empathy for them. I don't know if you can do that with the first. Maybe not, and that's why the writers didn't try. But even from a purely logical standpoint, we saw at the end of season 6 how much torture Spike withstood to get his soul back. So it doesn't make a lot of sense that the first is going to torture Spike into taking its side. At 30 minutes, 30 seconds. Buffy is looking over her bruises and cuts. She's in the school bathroom. Joyce appears and asks what happened. Now Buffy seems to be at home, not at school, and she says there's no time to heal. Everyone is counting on her. Joyce tells her her friends put too much pressure on her. They always have. She also says the evil isn't coming. It's already here. It's everywhere. Buffy says she has to stop it, and Joyce says no matter what her friends expect, evil is natural. No one can stop it. No one can stop nature. If you have been thinking of writing a novel and you aren't sure which of your ideas will work the best, or maybe you've started a first draft, but you keep getting distracted because you think another idea might be more compelling, you might find one of my course modules helpful. The course is how to plot your novel from idea to first draft, but you can buy just whatever module is helpful. And the second one is choosing a good idea for your novel. It covers how to tell if an idea includes enough conflict to sustain a novel and to sustain your excitement. And this relates to what I've been talking about with these Buffy episodes, where there are parts that just feel like filler, where I've said there just doesn't quite seem to be enough story for the number of episodes we have, which continues in this episode. So if you're struggling with that, how do you make sure there will be enough? This course module can help. And it can help you build on the idea you already have, ratchet up the conflict to make sure there's enough of it. You'll learn how to identify and expand conflicts, compare and evaluate ideas to see what's most likely to work. for a novel, and how to create short, specific what-if statements that can help ensure your idea will hook you and your readers for an entire novel. The module includes examples from the sci-fi medical horror novel Lakewood and the classic Pride and Prejudice, so this can work for any type of novel you are writing. You might want to watch the first module and generating ideas as well, but you don't need to. You can jump right to this one if you have plenty of ideas or too many ideas already. You can get the Choosing a Good Idea for Your Novel module on patreon.com/LisaMLilly/shop. It is $10 to buy, or if you are a patron at the $5 and up level, you get that free along with all the other modules of the course. So feel free to check it out, see if you think it might be helpful. That's Patreon, patreon.com/LisaMLilly, LISA. M as in Marie, LILLY/shop. Patreon.com/LisaMLilly/shop. A bell rings and Buffy wakes up. She dozed off in her cubicle while a student was talking to her. He is not happy and tells her she's just like all the others. Buffy argues she's hip. She, quote, relates to the young people, end quote. This is another moment of what we saw early in the season where Buffy, unaccountably, at the age of 21, doesn't know how to talk to high schoolers. Again, for the humor, I'm a little more willing to go with it here because she is flustered and she's saying, don't go, and he says, Roger? And Buffy says, Roger, yes, she knew that, though clearly she didn't. This suggests that last episode, too, she fell asleep when she saw Joyce and last time, but it's possible the first is infiltrating her dreams and undermining her. Either way, the questions Joyce raises do emotional damage to Buffy. Robin watches Buffy from his office. Giles now counts down the time to sundown in the Summers house. Xander is holding a hammer and tells the potentials not to look so worried. Things aren't so bad, despite that they don't know where Spike is or how to fight the first or when this ubervamp will attack. The house is boarded up. They just need to trap the ubervamp in the pantry. Willow suggests they ease the newbies into the joking in the face of death thing. Buffy is there too. She says they'll be okay. Annabelle looks fairly still and calm, though we did see her take a couple of deep breaths earlier. Willow apologizes that she can't do a spell, and here is where we see that what Joyce said is either reflecting Buffy's own feelings already or cast doubts, because Buffy, very quiet, looks sad, tells Willow no one expects her to make everything right. And we know she must be thinking about Joyce saying how Buffy has all the pressure on her. Willow feels really bad. She says, but Buffy needs help. But she doesn't suggest anything else that they could do for Buffy, which feels un-Willow-like. Buffy says she'll be okay, not with a whole lot of feeling. Kennedy asks for weapons, but Annabelle says we'll be armed when the Slayer feels we're ready. Molly thinks they're ready, and Annabelle tells Molly she must learn to control her fear. And Annabelle also tells Kennedy that they're with the Slayer safe as houses. And Kennedy says, has she seen the house they're in? Annabelle then cracks a bit, saying she guesses it will come straight for them. Andrew's spider sense is tingling. He wants to be untied. Buffy questions how he could possibly help. He says he knows they think he's a bad guy, a supervillain, that he went to the dark side, but it was just to pick up a few things, and he's back on the good side. Buffy makes a good point and says, and when were you good before? Andrew responds, okay, technically never, touche. He babbles on about being like Darth Vader and seeking redemption. They ignore him. This treatment of Andrew, again, troubles me. It just doesn't fit with Buffy, who was so concerned with not killing humans and who did protect Andrew and Jonathan. It was mainly so that Willow wouldn't go over the edge by killing them, but it feels weird that she's so nonchalant about the idea of Andrew being tied to a chair when this ubervamp is coming. And it's especially troubling because in this season, we are casting Buffy and friends as the epic good against the epic evil. In previous seasons, I feel like I would have given it a little more of a pass for just the fun of it, but we want to have this sense of Buffy in this struggle to save the world, but she doesn't care about Andrew. I don't need her to make him a focus, but maybe a little bit of struggle with, hey, guys, I don't like leaving him tied to the chair, but concluding that she just can't add that to everything else. She's got to protect the potentials first, and maybe saying something like the first isn't going to care about Andrew anyway, or some attempt to help him be safe. Buffy alone stares out the window. Giles finds her and reassures her that everyone there knows she's calling the shots. It surprised me a little. I didn't perceive that as something Buffy was worried about, but I suppose with Kennedy questioning her, maybe. Still, Buffy has experience with actual slayers disagreeing with her, like Kendra and Faith. It's hard to imagine she's that concerned that Kennedy won't follow her lead. She tells Giles she just hopes she's calling the right shots, and Giles says he has his faith in her and they're all depending on her. Buffy seems really uncertain and shaken. I guess I can see that because of the Turrican being so much stronger and because we've been emphasizing how tired Buffy is. I would have loved a little more, though, of Buffy's inner life. Granted, she isn't big on sharing her feelings, but something to get more of a sense of why this is throwing her so much. Buffy did face the first before. I would have found that more interesting than seeing Spike and the Turrican and the first over and over. Maybe a little pushback by Buffy to Giles. It also seems like Giles would remind Buffy of her past working with her friends to defeat evil, like Adam, like Glory, rather than emphasizing how alone Buffy is and how it's all on her. Yes, he sent her alone to face the demon in the musical, but that was for specific reasons. Giles thought she needed to learn to stand on her own, but then in the end, Giles went off to help her anyway. This, of course, adds to the idea that Giles might not be Giles, he might be the first, because intentional or not, he is undermining Buffy. We are now a little more than 3/4 through the episode. That's where we typically see the last major plot turn. It should grow from the midpoint and spin the story in yet another new direction. Molly bursts in at 34 minutes to tell them Annabelle ran off. It does come out of that midpoint where Buffy discovered she couldn't kill the Turrican by just staking it. Buffy returned home. The potentials were very worried because Buffy was so battered and beat up and wasn't able to kill the Turrican. And this is ultimately what leads to Annabelle running off. It does raise the stakes again, for sure, because now a potential is out there in the dark alone. Annabelle runs through the streets. The Turrican finds her, lifts her by the neck. We get a shot of her necklace with a cross on it falling to the ground and cut to a commercial, which is a great hook. Will Buffy find her in time? I do love the way Annabelle is developed. She is the first potential whose name we hear. She is very by the book. She's taking notes. She's admonishing the others to just follow the plan, listen to Buffy and Giles. She literally is the one carrying the books. And a lot of her admonishment is about squelching feelings. Don't give in to your fear, which tells us that is what Annabelle is doing with her feelings. She's ignoring it. She's denying it. She squelches it. And it really fits that when she finally lets it in, she completely loses it and does the worst possible thing and runs off by herself. I believe Annabelle would do something rash. I'm not entirely sure I buy that she would just race out of the house, But they do talk about the Turrican coming to the house at sundown, so maybe she figures it's going to be busy there and she's better off being somewhere else. Kennedy raised the issue of why are we on the Hellmouth? Shouldn't we go to the other side of the earth? So maybe that planted this idea. On return from the commercial, Buffy, alone in the dark street, finds Annabelle's dead body. So again, we have Buffy out there alone, maybe raising that issue of her superiority complex. I'm going to be better off alone. Or maybe she doesn't want to take more potentials out in the street and she has to leave Giles and Willow there to at least help with them. I would have liked to know that at some point, although generally in this part of the episode or of any story, you just want to drive forward toward the climax quickly. Typically, there shouldn't be any more exposition in that last quarter of a story. Even the last, say, third, you usually want all your exposition done. The Turrican attacks Buffy. We get a bit of Terminator-like music, and there's something of an homage because Buffy, injured and limping, runs into what looks like a factory or warehouse. There are a lot of pipes and gears and beams, and that happened in the original Terminator film. When Sarah Connor was injured, she does go into a factory. And as the Turrican pursues her, there is that similar vibe. It doesn't move super fast. It's kind of a callback to those original vampires in season 1 who are kind of slow moving, though it is clearly very strong and it can take some pretty good leaps. It follows her into this warehouse. They fight. She hits it with a long steel pipe. The Turrican beats her up really badly. She flies across the room, but then as it nears her, she kicks a mechanism that drops a stack of heavy steel beams that were suspended above. The whole stack falls on the Turrican, and we think it's vanquished. Buffy lurches away, and the Terminator-type music starts again as the Turrican rises from those beams and advances toward her. It throws Buffy through a brick wall, and the entire wall falls down on her. She is buried in rubble and steel, and the entire screen goes black. At 37 minutes 4 seconds, the entire screen is still black, and we hear Xander say, "Buffy." He uncovers her. She looks dead as he, Willow, and Giles stare down at her. This shows the value of Buffy having died twice already in the series because there is real suspense. Normally, you would never think that in the middle of the season, the protagonist might be dead, but here we don't know. As with my questions about where the main plot started, it's not completely clear here where the climax started. The climax is where the two opposing forces have their final clash and resolve the conflict. That last quarter of any story is driving fast toward the climax, and often it just flows right into that final confrontation. I feel like here it is probably when the fight began in the warehouse. Now, this is supposed to resolve the conflict for the two main forces for this particular episode. So does it end when Buffy loses that fight? We'll find out she's not dead, but she definitely lost the fight. Or is the conflict ongoing because we're going to see something major happen at the end of the episode? And the reason it's so hard to sort out is that we don't know what the first's main goal was for the episode. Was it trying to kill Buffy? Was it trying to kill potentials? Was it trying to undermine her? And we don't really know Buffy's main goal. Yeah, she wanted to stop the first, but that's sort of a given. It's further muddled because if the Turrican wanted to kill potentials, why wouldn't it just go to the Summers house while Buffy's away? It killed Annabelle. It could just head to the house. There's no Slayer there. And it seems like the first could know that because the first seems to be able to pop up wherever as long as it's in the guise of a dead person. After we see Buffy's possibly dead body, the scene cuts to Drusilla, who's really the first, saying, do you know why you're alive? And in a way, this is to answer the audience questions about Buffy once we realize she's alive, and maybe to explain why we have these scenes with Spike. The first tells him he's alive for only one reason, because, quote, I wish it, end quote. The first continues that it wishes it because it's not done with him. Spike tells the first he's out, it can't pull his puppet strings anymore. And the first, as Drusilla says, and what makes you think you have a choice? What makes you think you will ever be any good at all in this world? And Spike says she does because she believes in me. This is a bit of a victory for Spike. He resists the first, but it raises a lot of questions. Can the first still pull Spike's puppet strings? Then why doesn't it just do it? It wants Spike around for some reason, but we don't know what. Normally, it is good to have story questions. The question of, is it Giles or is it the first? Is a question that creates suspense. It keeps us hooked. We want to find out the answer. The question of Spike, what does the first want with Spike, is likewise a story question. For me, we go back to that well so often. We return to Spike and Drusilla, Spike and the Turrican, so often that I am not interested anymore. And that shows the challenge of these types of story questions. Yes, you can keep the audience hanging that way, but if you do it too long without advancing the story and just kind of keep saying, hey, remember this question, what do you think the first is doing? After a while, it just doesn't matter. And even with Giles, there's a bit of that because he keeps basically saying the same thing through this episode. Big evil, worst thing we've ever faced, don't know how to stop it, it's all on you, Buffy. And as he continues, it just starts to feel like, okay, but when are we going to do something? At 38 minutes, 21 seconds, a battered and wounded Buffy, who looks as bad off as we've ever seen her, sits in another room as Giles and Willow talk. The potentials are there too, the two remaining potentials. Giles says they could make other plans, but Buffy was the plan. Willow asks if Buffy could die. He says he doesn't know. There might be internal bleeding. Willow asks what they do if she can't fight, because they can't beat this thing. Giles says they're back at square one, and Xander asks what square that would be. Giles isn't sure. The first predates everything they know. The two potentials and Anya look worried and somber. Giles doesn't know how to fight it. Buffy emerges and says he's right. Something's always been out there to try to destroy the world, and they've beaten them back. But they're not dealing with those kind of things anymore. They're dealing with the reason they exist. Evil, the strongest, the first. Giles worries that Buffy is tired and should rest, and Buffy gives her speech. She says, I'm beyond tired. I'm beyond scared. I'm standing on the mouth of hell, and it is going to swallow me whole, and it'll choke on me. We're not ready. They're not ready. They think we're going to wait for the end to come, like we always do. I'm done waiting. They want an apocalypse? Oh, we'll give them one. Anyone else who wants to run, do it now, because we just became an army. We just declared war. From now on, we won't just face our worst fears, we will seek them out. We will find them and cut out their hearts one by one until the first shows itself for what it really is. And I'll kill it myself. There is only one thing on this earth more powerful than evil, and that's us. Any questions? And the episode ends. That speech always gives me goosebumps when Buffy gives it, when I read it. It is very powerful because Buffy is so battered and she is making this declaration of war. So what is this in terms of the story? I think it is the climax of the episode, and if so, this was a Pyrrhic victory for Buffy. The victory is she is still alive, but at a tremendous, almost unbearable cost. So that is a Pyrrhic victory when the protagonist wins at that cost. So we could see it as that. We could see it as a game changer, which takes the whole world in a new direction after this. And minor spoiler, it does shift. It could be the midpoint of a 2-episode arc if we look at it together with Showtime. That's what I thought when I first looked at it for the podcast, because this is a major commitment by Buffy to the quest. She is throwing caution to the wind. She's basically saying, I will probably die during this, but I will take this first evil with me. But it does not really fit when I look at what happens in Showtime. They are certainly connected, but that doesn't feel like part 2 of this episode. We could see it also as the midpoint of the season. It's the end of episode 10. There are 22 episodes. And it may be as we go on with the season, I'll try to remember to look back at that. If it's a game changer, we could view it as part of the falling action. The falling action is where the writers tie up loose ends, resolve subplots, and continue season arcs. We could see the first subplot being somewhat resolved with Spike refusing to join the first. That happens before this final speech by Buffy. So subplots could be resolved before or after the falling action. They can pretty much resolve any time, but this is where you would tie them up. And in a full season, sometimes it is just a continuing subplot, and I think that is more what we have with Spike and the first. But regardless how you think of it, it is a very powerful moment and is, for me, what essentially saves the episode and makes it worth rewatching every time. I do have more in foreshadowing about some of these issues. If you are not sticking around for that, because there are spoilers, thank you so much for listening. And a special thank you to patrons who support the podcast. Come back in 2 weeks for season 7, episode 11, where more potential slayers arrive and Buffy faces the Turrican. The arrival of the 3 potentials foreshadows many more potentials to come. Giles says something about a handful. We get more than a handful. The house gets pretty full. But in the next episode, it will be, I want to say there's 5 of them. I love this speech by Buffy in this episode, and it foreshadows many Buffy speeches to come. This one was quite stirring, but later Buffy becomes almost a parody of herself. That first speech works so well for her. It gets her out of that dark place she is. It motivates the others that she keeps going back to it. And that relates to a theme of the season from now on, which is the role of a leader or a general in war. And we get a little more foreshadowing of that by Andrew's comments about Buffy seems like a leader. She has shiny hair. A bit of political commentary from Andrew, the role of, in any election, how well someone presents, how good looking they are, sometimes how tall they are, how good of a speaker they are. These are things that matter in leadership when it is something that you need to be elected to, or even sometimes in persuading people to follow you. We'll examine, why do people follow a leader? Is Buffy a good leader? It never becomes clear if Joyce was the first. When she appeared to Buffy, she will appear again. That is a story question that never gets answered. I suppose it doesn't have to be, but I would have liked to have known. The awkwardness of Giles not hugging or touching anything continues, and we don't find out for another 2-3 episodes that it is really Giles. This creates problems in the narrative. I could go with the Giles not touching anything because I suppose that could be sustained. All these episodes will happen over the course of a few days. So maybe with everything going on, it's realistic that when they finally think about it, no one remembers if Giles touched anything. The plot problem is Giles isn't acting like himself. For instance, if this is really Giles and we find out it is, why didn't he return any of Buffy's calls? It seems really strange. She's frantically trying to reach him. He doesn't call her back. That is never explained. It could be, but it never is. This idea of Giles constantly saying, well, the only plan was Buffy, does not fit Giles at all when you look back at the seasons. Buffy has almost always, for the climax, had some amount of help from her friends. They have all rallied around her. We have been told explicitly that is why Buffy is still alive when so many Slayers die sooner. Giles knows that, and yet all he does in this episode and the coming episodes is act as if it's all on Buffy. He doesn't have any thoughts about other approaches, and that does not seem right. Sometimes you need to and should mislead the audience. It creates suspense. You want to have 2 or 3 possible things that something could mean, but to be fair with the audience, when they look back, it has to work both ways. And when we look back at this, it really doesn't work if it is Giles. I am sure the writers did this because we emphasize Buffy's aloneness so that when she shares her power with all the potential Slayers, it is a giant moment. I would have liked to have seen it emphasized some other way, though, than having Giles and pretty much everyone seemingly forget that they always band together. I get that Willow can't do major spells. I think that is very well developed and done, why Willow is afraid. But no one even tries to explore other ways to support Buffy. And I feel like that would have been more realistic, and it could have been done by cutting some of the repetition to make space for it. Robin Wood watching Buffy being cryptic is likewise a bit frustrating. It works better than the odd Giles conduct, partly because we don't know Robin. With Giles, we have 6 previous seasons to look at and say, wow, this isn't like Giles. With Robin, we don't know what he's like. It's never quite clear why Robin doesn't show his cards earlier, that he is the son of a Slayer. But I can accept that maybe he knows Buffy's a Slayer, but he wants to hang back and learn about her before sharing. Or maybe he senses that the first has some control over him. He doesn't want to be more in Buffy's orbit. Finally, it works because the actor is so engaging that it's just fun to watch him. Another thing that is not explained in this episode, but is in an indirect way explained in the next, is why doesn't the Turrican make sure Buffy is dead? The answer is probably that the First does not want Buffy dead yet, and that answers why Go Through the Potentials, maybe Faith, and Buffy last, because we'll find out when Anya and Giles go to visit Beljax's eye, the Oracle, that the First is empowered now because Buffy dying and then coming back to life has opened an opportunity for the First. It has thrown off the balance, and that's why the First can do these things. Unfortunately, it robs this episode of a bit of its power, but I think that works ultimately because we do get an explanation. I love Anya saying, oh, sure, Spike will help if he's not dead or crazy or killing people. This starts to lay the groundwork for the potentials to question what is the deal with Spike. Why is Buffy so concerned with him? And her friends will ultimately have some questions as well. But it particularly is a good way to lay the groundwork for the potentials losing their confidence in Buffy, which they didn't have a ton to begin with. This also starts the potentials as a group being not that interesting to me. We will get so many, it'll be hard to keep track of who they are. This episode does a pretty good job of differentiating them. Kennedy will be an important character. It's a good way to introduce her, very consistent with who she is later. Molly, I will promptly forget who she is. I can't remember offhand how long she makes it. And that will continue. I think it is intentional on the part of the writers for reasons that go into Buffy being a leader, but it is not one of my favorite parts of this season. I do really enjoy the next episode, the showdown with the Turrican, so I can't wait to talk to you about that. Thank you so much for listening. Come back in 2 weeks for Season 7, Episode 11, Showtime, where more potentials come to Sunnydale and the First makes its next move. You can find back episodes of Buffy and the Art of Story, as well as the Buffy and the Art of Story books and all my fiction at lisalily.com. To support the podcast, hear extra bonus content, and get each regular episode a few days early, join the Patreon community at patreon.com/LisaMLilly. Music for this episode was written and performed by Robert Newcastle. Buffy and the Art of Story is a production of Spiny Woman LLC, copyright 2024. All rights reserved.